Welcome to Beyond Disruption, where you'll learn how emerging tech is changing the world of accounting, business, and finance. Our guest experts break down the latest news in everything from blockchain to robotics, artificial intelligence to human intelligence. Tune in to find out how you can stay ahead of the curve.
Hello, thanks for listening to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, where we share insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you stay ahead of the curve. This episode, Accounting Podcasters, New Digital Mindsets That Move Us Beyond the Multiples to the Microphone. Another in our series of exclusive conversations that happen where disruptive technology meets human intelligence. From our London office, I'm Sonia Rothwell. September is International Podcasting Month, and that leads up to International Podcast Day, which is on Monday, September the 30th. So in this episode, we'll be talking to accounting and finance professionals who've taken on a whole new digital mindset, broadening what's already a pretty specialised skill set to include these digital know-how that's become so essential today as podcasting becomes an integral part of today's online space. Our guests this week are all widely experienced professionals, so I feel a bit intimidated among all these giants. So they're mostly in accounting and finance, and some have also been guests on this podcast too. They all have one thing in common: podcasting. They are Rob Walsh, who's Vice President of Podcaster Relations at LibSyn, which we used to host this podcast and which was one of the first, if not the first, podcast provider. Sullivan, who's a speaker, author, and host of the Businesses That Care podcast, joins us from Pittsburgh. Blake Oliver is a CPA who specialises in cloud computing and hosts the Cloud Accounting podcast, and he's in LA, which he's been telling us is very hot today. Georgette Rowland Osborne is also with us, and Georgette's a London-based business money consultant, author, speaker, and of course, podcast host. And last, but certainly not least, my colleague Kyle Hannon, who's been producing the Go Beyond Disruption podcast for us. Kyle, podcasting has been with us for a very long time now. It's been well over 10, maybe 15 years. How did it start?
Sure. Well, let's see what I can do. A quick potted history of podcasting. The internet has been around for a long time. Podcasting hasn't. What used to be audio blogging in the late 1990s was then developed by a couple of internet code writers and an ex-MTV DJ called Mark Curry. And that developed something called an RSS feed, which used a bit of code to bundle media and various things together so that the media, the audio file, whatever it was, wasn't something you had to go to a web page to download and then synchronize to your device manually using a cable. What you did was then just took that RSS feed, a tiny little piece of code, and put that into your podcast device or your podcast app, and then it would automatically send you anything updated, any new episodes, complete with artwork and all the information, the show notes, directly to you. And you can use that for anything. Now, a podcast doesn't have to only be audio, though that's how most people understand podcasting these days, as just being an audio show. It doesn't have to be. You can use that RSS feed to deliver almost anything. It can be video, it can be a PDF or something like that as well. But podcasting started off as audio blogging, which you have to go to a web page to download, play off the page, or you'd have to synchronize it using a cable to your old mobile phones or whatever PDA. Remember PDAs, Palm Pilot's personal digital assistant? Little handheld computers, which you'd have to manually synchronize, download the file, and then you can carry it around with you. About 2001, the RSS feed started to appear in the wild for the first time. 2004, that MTV DJ, Mark Curry, used it to start to deliver his own shows to people who subscribed to it. And then later that year, a columnist at the Guardian newspaper here in the UK used the word podcast for the first time. What he did was he took the word iPod, which was a device that Apple released in 2001 for music using iTunes, portable music device. He took that and he added the word webcast to it, and he got podcast out of it. So that, I think, is the first time it was actually used in public. And then the next year, what really saw a massive change is when Apple added podcasts to its iTunes music directory. So for the very first time, people who would already be using iTunes for music listening on their iPods or what would soon become available on the iPhone, podcasts was front and center, a part of what people had on their devices. So that really started podcast listening's real development. And fast forward to this year, now for the first time, according to data, research in the US indicates that for the very first time, more people are listening or have listened to podcasts than aren't. So it's now more than 50%. So it's developed massively. More than 24 million different podcast episodes online, about 750,000 different podcast shows, and around 150,000 English language podcasts are out there. And podcasting is taking off massively around the world. Big in China, big in South America and Spanish-speaking countries, developing massively. Almost half of new podcasters are women. So it is really something that most people who may have only discovered podcasts for the last couple of years, most people may be surprised to know that podcasts have been around for about 15 years. And fast forwarding to next year, there are predictions that certainly in the US, it will be, as an industry, generating more than $1 billion in advertising revenue. So that is a big milestone. So it's come on in leaps and bounds. And just to put everyone in the picture, most podcast listening happens on Apple devices, about maybe 65%. But only 10% of Apple users actually listen to podcasts. So that means 90% of Apple users aren't yet listening. And only 1% of Android listeners are listening, because 80% of all devices in the world are Android, and only 1% of those people are listening to podcasts. So there is still 99% of Android listeners out there still to become podcast listeners. So the sky really is the limit.
I suppose we should go back to basics a bit and say, what is it? What's the function of a podcast? Because you've mentioned lots of things that people, it's a very democratic form of getting your opinions out there. But why do people do it?
Well, I think for podcasts, it's a way of sitting down and removing the middleman, because you don't have to go to the radio for your information. You don't have to wait until your favorite program is on. You don't have to listen for an entire week before there may be a 15-minute special on your local radio station that talks about the stuff you want to. Podcasts allow you to make the content that focuses on stuff that you're keen on anytime you like. You can make a program about your favorite hobby, your deepest interest, your biggest cultural passions. You can make them, or if you don't make them, you can certainly find them whenever you like. It's a way of making it in a way that everyone can access, and it talks about nothing but the stuff that you want to hear. As the producer for this podcast series, I know that we decided to make it because there were so many conversations that were happening around us, and it just made sense to capture them and share them with a community of people who were interested in the same kind of thing, which is why we started making Go Beyond Disruptions as a podcast. So it's something which made sense to us. It's become successful, and I think every podcaster out there has that dilemma. Do you have the time to do the stuff that you love doing? And I think possibly the biggest dilemma at the moment is, if you're a listener to podcasts, how do you find time to listen to all of them? Because there are so many out there, and they're getting better and better.
That's absolutely true. I'm a podcast addict, and I know I'm in a safe space here, so I can say that. But you're talking there about building a communities, and I think, Julianne, you might be able to talk a bit more about how these things add value, but they don't add value in the way that people might imagine.
Yeah, and it depends upon if you are doing a podcast like I do a podcast, and my podcast has morphed into a real niche in which I talk to companies who already have created and sustained great culture. So each episode gives the C-suite leader an idea that they can implement within their own company. But when I work with companies to create internal podcasts that are just for their employees and workforce, now we're talking about informing, engaging, and celebrating. So it's really a different kind of focus whether you're creating a podcast for your own internal workforce or it's going out, which has to do with your own branding.
So how did you get into podcasting?
It's a pretty funny story. I'll make it short, but because I had no intentions of doing a podcast, and I was looking for some information to be on a panel about podcasting, and I thought, well, I'll do the stuff about what questions to ask. And while I was doing the research, I met someone who was a podcaster. He invited me to a mini mastermind on Facebook. Then we had a conversation. I asked him how much his coaching was, and I decided, okay, I'll try that because that's just the kind of person I am. And then I just totally fell in love with it, and it has had its own twists and turns. I've learned so much, but I'm sure all the podcasters would agree, created the greatest relationships with people, including Kyle. I mean, I mean that, right? It's great to know Kyle, and I probably would have not known Kyle since we're across the pond from each other any other way.
So I think getting involved with podcasts really requires people to think more in 4 dimensions, doesn't it?
Or 6.
Or 6. So do you think, I mean, this is a question for you. Is the digital mindset something that is easy to slip into if you are used to a more analog way of doing things?
I had a great coach, and he let me know how many moving parts there were before I jumped in. I have probably talked as many people out of podcasting as I have coached into podcasting. Because I think people should know up front there are a lot of moving parts. And it does take a lot of time. And I think people should know that up front. It's definitely, you have to be passionate about it, I think, or it's not going to happen. Maybe Kyle knows the answer to this, but I think for the most part, podcasts last 7 episodes, I think was the last thing I read. And then people quit.
That's absolutely right. And this is probably something that Rob from LibSyn will speak to. But there is the deadly 7. They say that most podcasts, they hit the first wall when they get to episode 7. And that's when most podcasts that are going to fade will fade. That, I think, is when you have the use of that terrible phrase, pod fading. That 7th episode is the first wall that they'll often hit.
And there'll be other walls.
Oh, yes, there are. Yes, there are.
Georgette, what would you add to that about, the longevity of a podcast? How can you keep the momentum going?
Well, I do, and then I don't, and then I do, then I don't. Julian actually nailed it when she said it's a good idea to warn people how much work it really is. And I did start off doing it as seasons so that there would be some sort of breathing space in between doing them, because I started doing them all by myself, and then I would give some of it to one of my virtual assistants, and that helped a lot. But what it doesn't do is help you in terms of your content and what you want to put out there. That always comes back to you. And when you are doing content in multiple places, starting with yourself, you have to be very realistic about where you can place your time and your attention. So podcasting for me, I love it because it's sitting and it's talking, and I love to talk. So there was that. But I think that the number one thing is you have to love doing it. And what helped me was I did my my book for Audible. Before I started my podcast, I used that as a practice run. And that's how I got comfortable, because that was hell on earth to do. So podcasting after that was just a walk in the park. Dead easy, was no longer a problem. And ironically, having done that and done the podcast, that side of my publishing is the most lucrative. So if I hadn't decided to do podcasting, I wouldn't have tested it to do the Audible book, and I never would have got royalties from it. So you never know where things lead.
So you can get something out of any investment of time and, cash investment that you put into
Indeed.
it. But I think people do, until they do it, they don't quite realise how much work goes into producing audio. If you listen to a radio program, there will be a whole staff of people who will be doing the research, will be doing the technical side of it, and will be doing all of the presenting. There'll quite frequently be a clutch of people, but it's just you, which is it's refreshing on one hand, but it does mean that you have to learn a lot more skills, don't you?
Oh, completely. I mean, I'm a, as Carl and I have discussed before, I am a tech nerd. I love anything that you plug in and press and load. That's my life. But the difference with audio is it's not about you. It's about the person at the other end. And what stuck with me was always being told by my podcast mentor was the quality. People will watch a bad video, but they will turn off poor audio. And everything was always focused on that. So I became a bit obsessive about it, to be honest. But it was an excuse to learn more technology. But you can go too far. I mean, if you could see in this office and open cupboards and drawers, it would horrify you. As to the graveyard of technology that actually coming back again, I actually don't need half of it now, and I get the same result.
I mean, we were talking earlier about niches and about finding a niche, and cloud accounting, by all accounts, is a very sort of specialised area. So I suppose what I would be wanting to know from Blake is, you're a news service. You're quite different to what we're doing here. You provide news. How much investment do you have to put into producing the podcasts you produce?
Well, it was a lot more upfront. When you're learning how to do this sort of thing, it might take all day to put together an episode, right? Or learn how to post it. But we've been doing it for a year and a half now, so it's gotten a lot quicker. I can maybe put up a 30-minute episode in a couple hours, which I always tell people, if you're editing audio, which I do the editing, you can expect to spend 4 to 5 minutes per minute of audio if you really want to make it good, right? And I think that's one of the keys is keeping it tight, because when people are listening, the dead space or the content that's maybe not the best it's pretty evident, right? It's not that they're not able to scan through a podcast episode the way they can scan through an article. So yeah, for us, it was with the show, the Cloud Accounting Podcast, it started out as a newsletter, actually. I had a newsletter that was like a weekly roundup of stories that I was reading. And I started doing that simply because I was reading all these news stories, and I felt like the traditional accounting, trade publications, and association magazines weren't really emphasizing technology the way that I thought it needed to be emphasized in our space. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to create a newsletter that people can subscribe to, and they'll get the top 5 to 10 stories that I read this week. And I'm reading them anyway. So this is just a way of taking something I'm already doing and creating some value for other people. And I was getting subscribers, and then I started listening to a lot of podcasts because I got some AirPods, the Apple wireless earbuds. And I think that's one of those things that's driving the adoption of podcasts and people listening, is that now it's so easy. You don't have the absence of the wires makes a big difference. And so you can multitask while you listen. It's the only form of media where you can do that. So I can do the dishes or the laundry, or I can go running or ride my bike, or in LA, especially commute to work, right? I mean, people are going an hour each direction. They've got a lot of time to listen. So I said, well, people are getting this email, but it's not really ideal because we get so many emails. Let me try doing this in an audio format. And that really worked. And I was having a lot more fun because I could have guests on to talk about and analyze the stories. So it wasn't just me anymore. And it became a way to meet other people that I always wanted to talk to and get their opinions and sort of build this kind of online community around this topic of cloud accounting.
I think that, again, you've hit on the idea that the point of podcasting is relationship building, and it's a way of getting of learning about the people who are, who you're working with, the people that you might be employing, and building a relationship with them. And you can't get that from, like you said, you can't get from a newsletter, you can't get it from however much you send out to them in the way that you can through someone's voice. And you form a kind of little private club because it's just you and them while you're listening to that podcast.
And podcasting is so wonderful because, Kyle mentioned the RSS feeds earlier. It's one of those rare forms of media where if you produce it, you own that RSS feed. That is an open standard and nobody can take that away from you. So once you have those subscribers, it's not like a Facebook group where Facebook could suddenly change their algorithm and now you aren't able to reach your followers, or they could shut down your site, your group. Or it's not like the LinkedIn newsfeed where if they change something and you have to pay suddenly to reach people, now that doesn't work anymore. With email and RSS feeds, you own that vector. So once you get a subscriber, they're yours as long as you don't lose them, right? It's not you're not on somebody else's platform. You've created your own platform.
Now, one of the things that everybody has to do when they're establishing a podcast is to find their voice, the crowded space. I suppose this is a question for Julianne. How do you encourage people to find their voice?
Well, again, I think it goes back to passion. What are you good at? And when you find out what that is, then you move in that direction. For instance, when I first started my podcast, it was called Mere Mortals Unite, because I had a passion that people gave their power away, that they had much more power than they knew they had. And I would have guests on, and they had to share their superpower, but it had to be a superpower that everyone could have. And I've always been focused on, when you're on my show, it's not about you, it's what you can give my listeners. That's something that's been the same all along. So they were there telling people this is what you can do to enhance this superpower in your life. And the superpower might have been networking, it might have been communication, it might have been laughter, it might have been patience. A whole gamut of different ideas. And then as I became more of a business culture expert, I started out in employee engagement, went to employee experience, went to business culture. I started this special series, Businesses That Care, and I started talking to consultants about how they worked with companies to engage their employees. And then I moved on and I talked to C-suite leaders, and then I really focused on that. So at this point, I've interviewed 60 C-suite leaders who already have great cultures, but it's still the same. You come on to my show to share what your knowledge is, some of the things that you use, some of the strategies you use to help others. So I think in finding your voice to your audience, you have to find your own voice too, and that is going to morph and change, which is what Georgette was talking about earlier.
I suppose you would agree with that then, with Georgette, that it's about finding your place and something that you're comfortable with. So I hate this word because it sounds so jargony, but it's about being authentic, about being yourself, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Authentic. So much. I mean, when I started, I was very much the accountant talking through a microphone, and it was very practical and almost a little bit finger waving, because you know what we can be like.
That's why I'm recovering now.
Oh my gosh. Well, I haven't. I keep telling myself I want to escape, and then in the words of Al Pacino, they keep pulling me back in, and it is so true. So yes, so when I started out, it was very much like that, and it was great from the point of view of going into corporate meetings, and you'd walk in and someone would say, oh, I listened to you before, because they Google you, don't they? And I listened to you before you came. So that was great, but it really wasn't reaching the people I really wanted to help, not those who had finance teams already or already had things in place. So I kind of changed it more to be about more of a human experience. So it's not finance specifically that's the issue. There are other things, but finance will make it more understandable. If you understand the finances, you can solve that problem. And just like Blake said, that then it became fun because you invite people on who have an expertise that you don't have in an area and get their take on it, which I didn't envisage. It was always just going to be me talking into a microphone, giving my expertise. So, and that came over time and from feedback. So, yeah, that's so true.
I never thought I could benefit so much from my own ignorance. and that I get to play, even if I know the answer, I get to pretend I don't so that I can ask my guest. And I learn so much. It's great. I love it.
I mean, Georgette mentioned the dreaded F word, the feedback. What have people said to you, Blake, that you've learned from? Because once you put something out there, they build it and they will come, and people do want to engage because that's the other side of being a recognizable voice or face, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I have heard the saying that if you're not if somebody's not upset at you, you're not doing it right, because you're just too boring. So I try to take the negative feedback actually as a positive thing, right? You can't please everybody. And so I actually had the CEO of a company that, we exposed some unsavory practices of this company, not disclosing the offshoring of financial information from United States CPA firms to the Philippines. And they were engaging with accounting firms in the United States and not telling them about this, that people offshore were seeing this information. And that has serious implications for their insurance, for security. They should know this. And we exposed that on the show. And the CEO went after my day job and tried to get me in trouble with the CEO of my company where I'm employed. So that was an interesting experience. Not the most fun thing, right? I had a member of their board call me, who's a very influential person in the accounting world, and try to convince me to let this go and to retract it. And I had to say no. So it's just a small thing, but
well, that's feedback.
That's feedback for sure, right? And then of course there are just simply people who disagree with you. But I enjoy the debate. Right. That's like I think that's like I've taken some personality tests and I am a debater in some of them. Like that's the name of it. So give me a little bit of conflict and I will thrive.
I don't think any of us would want to put people off getting involved in podcasting, because I think what you're talking about is you've become a news service, and that's a whole different world once you start shining lights on unsavory practices. But if you're doing something which is meant to, I suppose, like we're doing now, trying to invite people into our world a bit more, then it's not really as scary as perhaps you might imagine. I mean, I'm sitting in a room here, you're sitting in rooms here, but we happen to be talking to many thousands of people.
Well, you can definitely, even if you're not a news service, you can cause some controversy. For instance, there's an eternal debate going on here in the States, and I'm sure elsewhere, about whether or not firms should be tracking their time and using timesheets. And you would be amazed at how intense that conversation can get, because you're attacking somebody's basically their business model when you criticize that. And people get very passionate about that. So I think the important thing is, if you are starting a podcast, the worst thing to do is to be boring. Because there's just so many shows out there, nobody's going to listen. So if you have an opinion, you need to be willing to state that opinion and defend it. And it may not be fun if somebody comes out after you, but that's actually a good thing, I think.
Now, you mentioned that you're sort of sending out this podcast out into the world, and then things happen around it. But like any podcast, we choose to put our shows online and send them out there before everyone can share them. And wherever the audience is, they can enjoy them. But in our case, we choose the leading podcast file hoster, LibSyn, which, as I said in my introduction, was one of the first, if not the first, to provide this service. Now, we're one of many leading accounting and finance shows that they support, including some of the names that you'll recognise. Now, their Vice President of Podcast Relations is Rob Walsh, and he's given us a behind-the-scenes look at what those podcasts are and and how they're doing, though we asked him to start with a quick overview of LibSyn itself and where it fits into the podcast space today.
Thanks for having me on. Per LibSyn and where we fit into podcasting space. First, it's important to understand Apple Podcast. One, that is where 60% of the consumption of podcasts happens globally. And two, Apple does not host a single podcast file. Many people start out thinking they just upload to Apple. That is not the case. Apple Podcasts is just a directory or list, really, of what podcasts are out there. But to get in that list, you as a podcaster must host your file somewhere else and must have a valid RSS feed. And LibSyn is the largest and oldest of those somewhere else's. We host the podcasts for 3 of the big 4 accounting firms, Deloitte, EY, and PwC. And all 3 have multiple podcasts. Why they all chose LibSyn is simple: reliability. And LibSyn does not put our brand first. We put our customer's brand out front. In addition to the 3 of the big 4, we also host many podcasts from small and mid-sized accounting firms. With any podcast host, what you are looking for is a place to host your media files and to easily manage your RSS feed. The RSS feed is the core of your podcast. It is what you submit to Apple and other services, and it tells end users where to find your media files on the internet. You must have a valid RSS 2.0 feed, and it must be accepted by Apple Podcasts for you to even say you are a podcast. Another thing you should look for in a podcast host is metrics, to see if anyone is out there and downloading your episodes, and if so, where they are located. That is what a good podcast host will provide for you. Accurate metrics, or should I say numbers. I think maybe, just maybe, numbers are something accountants care about.
I think he's right. And, we've used LibSyn for our podcast for a long time. And we've been so pleased to have Rob come into this podcast and talk to us about other accountants and accounting firms that do the same thing as we do, which should be no surprise. So, Sonia, back to you.
That was Rob Walsh from LibSyn. Now, after all this effort, does it make a difference to your work and to your relationship with your clients and your customers? Is it worth the effort in that sense? Georgette, you first.
I touched on it briefly before when I said I would walk into a meeting and having been searched online. Not so much these days, but in previous years when I first started, podcasting was not something that you knew, that most people knew what it was, or let alone knew somebody who did it. So they were really quite impressed. So that would put you on a good footing anyway. Also, you don't know who's listening. So even though you can look at downloads and stats and so forth, when somebody who you don't know, or who you do know but didn't think was listening to you, approaches you and said, I listened to you the other day and that really helped me. Can we, or is it possible? And like, wow, okay. Because, you do all that work and you just really don't know who's listening to you and the change you're making. And from the other side of it, from more of a, that's the giving side, from more of a taking side, I suppose, the way to put it, is the people that I've met from doing it is phenomenal. You just cannot fathom. And even people who normally, if you imagine walking up to somebody and saying, hi, my name's Georgette, would you? And then, excuse me? But the minute you throw podcast into the mix, okay, it changes the complete conversation, the dynamics of the relationship, everything. And sometimes when I've had enough and I've been in masterminds and I say, well, why do you keep doing it if it's so tiring? Because I never would have met the people that I meet if I didn't do it. So it does. I mean, I'm only here because I started a podcast, no other reason. So there you go.
I mean, that's what you said earlier, wasn't it, Blake, about you can play dumb, you can ask questions that you never would otherwise be able to ask, and you can ask them of the people that otherwise you wouldn't have access to. Could you recognise what Georgette's saying about people react differently to you when you're doing podcasting?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with Georgette. When I go to conferences now, people will walk up to me who maybe I've met one time, or I know who they are, or I don't know them at all. And they will say, I feel like, Blake, I feel like I know you like a friend because I listen every week. And so now I have all these connections that I never had, even if I haven't talked to them before. It's I don't have to go through that whole process of let's get to know each other because they already know who I am. And a great example of, I mentioned the potential negative fallout of maybe a podcast or having some controversial positions. Yes, there's that. But there's also a lot of positivity. And an example is I recently left my full-time position. And my plan was simply to think about what I was going to do next for a while, consult, not really sure, going to take some time off. Well, I mentioned it on the show, and now I've got a handful of job offers. I mean, I'm never, putting yourself out there and creating some content that's helpful to people and letting them know what you do, right? I feel like if I keep this up, I'm never going to have to go job hunting again. And that is fantastic. I mean, just career-wise, right? I'm so glad I did this. It was the best investment in time I ever made.
I think that's what people will want to hear. Does it make a difference to your bottom line? And I think, Georgette, you were talking about how people recognize you, and people, and you both said that people have a different relationship with you and they can find you. But I mean, how common is it to be able to expand your business easily? Is it something that requires a lot of effort, or is it something that you have to be out there to try and test the water first? I think, I suppose it depends, but what do you think, Julianne?
Well, one of the things I was going to say is I think when you start podcasting out, I'm not talking about internal podcasting, you have no idea what opportunities can come your way. For me, I just published a book called Catalysts of Culture, and it's all based in my podcasts. And because of it, a publisher came to me and said, we'd like to publish a book. So the credibility that it gives you, because I'm sure everyone feels the same way when you are talking to individuals, and it's almost like you're doing mini case studies, right? You're just filling your brain with so much information. After a while, for those of us who, have been doing this for years, you become really smart because you've been gathering all this information. You may have been doing it through a podcast, and those relationships are short, although many of the people that I've had on the podcast, I continue to have, relationships with, friendships with. But it fills your own head with great ideas, and it gives you a lot more credibility for people, like Blake was saying. People are offering him a job. They know him. They know what he knows, right? They understand what he's been doing and his take on the world, his perspective, his focus. And that's what's happened to me. People understand, wow, you have over 200 episodes, right? Even that alone, I don't even care what you discuss on your episode. People know that you are serious, that you are committed. And I think that says a lot.
Yeah, and hopefully people listening to this are learning, and a little bit later on they'll learn even more because we will reveal how you can put your own podcast out there. There's more coming up in the second half, and we'll find out just what you need to do to start your own podcast. But as you're listening to our podcast, you might like to check out the other episodes of Go Beyond Disruption. There are over 70 if you're especially keen, and they're available online wherever you get your podcasts. Now, as I said, there are some basics before you can get out there and wow the world with your knowledge. What are the very, very basic things that you need in order to start your podcast? I think I'll ask that of Blake. So
it's amazingly affordable. The equipment has gotten so cheap. I use a microphone that cost $129 US. And you could just buy that and plug it into your computer and download some free software like Audacity, and you can get going. There's even apps on your phone that will let you do this now, just with your iPhone or something. So like cost is not the barrier, but the biggest barrier is actually your time, right? Because it does take a lot of time at first to learn how to do it right. And I'd still edit all the episodes myself because I want to make sure that I'm including the most relevant material, right? We cut a good amount. So, right, you need to have like 4 hours a week, I would say, at least, to dedicate to if you're doing a weekly show. And the other thing, though, it has nothing to do with equipment. It's actually really thinking deeply before you start about two things, right? What is the story you're going to tell? What is this podcast about? And be able to describe that to someone in a few words. So ours was easy, right? I just called it the Cloud Accounting Podcast, so you know what it's about. And that was just the topic I was interested in. But the harder thing was figuring out who is the audience and really thinking deeply, and actually even more than about the story, who is it you're trying to reach? So is it owners of small CPA firms? Is it bookkeepers? Is it accountants and bookkeepers? Is it in the US? Is it global? Is it users of a particular software? Is it, if you're a CPA or you're an accountant or a bookkeeper looking to get more clients, are they going to be listening? Is that who the audience is? If you specialize in real estate, are you going to make a podcast about real estate accounting, of which there is one? And the audience you choose should actually really influence the story you tell, because storytelling is all about those two things, right? And the audience is the most important part. So where I think we had a lot of success was in realizing accountants want to learn about technology. They want to stay up on what's going on in the industry, and they don't have a lot of time. So by summarizing everything that's going on and giving them a combination of news and best practices to help them grow their practices, like we create value, and they're going to tune in every week for that. And that it took a while, took maybe a few months to hit on that. I don't think we really figured it out until we'd done 50 episodes. But once we hit,
well past 7 episodes then.
Yeah, I think you have to really be willing to do like 100 episodes. And it took us that long to get to a real audience like that. And that's hard, to be willing to go for at least a year or two. So that's my takeaway is it's not about the equipment so much as it's about your time and the story you're telling and the audience you want to reach.
Would you agree with that, Georgette?
Oh, completely. I mean, listening to the different kind of shows that Julianne and Blake do, I remember being really hung up on evergreen content. Whatever I put out there must be relevant forever and ever and ever. And then seeing that there's been a real shift in topical content, particularly with pop culture and so forth, and realizing that actually that's just as relevant as stuff that goes out that, you want people to listen to, ad infinitum. So that kind of changed a lot for me. And it meant that things I really wanted to talk about, I could just talk about. And also the other thing for me was understanding what your strengths are. Some people are really good at interviews and they just do it so well. Others are really happy just talking by themselves to a microphone. And is not to get hung up on whether one is right or one is wrong or what you should be doing, but where you think your strength and your comfort zone is, because it's about giving the information that your listener wants. And the best way that you can get that out is the way you do it rather than the way you think other people should.
Julianne, you're an expert in change. How would you encourage people to pivot towards having the mindset that Blake and Georgette have described?
Well, when I do work in change, some of the number one reasons people have a hard time in change is, first of all, they don't have enough information. So I think it's really important to people to have information, and that includes knowing what you like to do, what you do well, and what you don't like. For instance, I do not edit my own shows. I don't know how to edit audio, nor do I want to know how to edit audio. And I'm willing to be honest with myself about that and say I'm willing to pay X amount of dollars to have that done. On the other side, I have tried several times to have other people do my show notes, but it never worked. They never were like I liked them. So I finally said, okay, how can I make this so that I like to do them? And I figured out a way to do it. I think when you're doing this, and I'm sure Blake and Georgette would agree, over time you learn that having systems in place makes everything a lot more efficient. And when things are more efficient, you don't feel so bogged down. You don't want to do this and get up in the morning and say, oh, today I got to do a podcast. I got to find another guest. That's not a good attitude to have in anything, right? As a speaker, I don't want to, just before I get on stage, go, oh, I got to make this presentation, It doesn't make for a good outcome. So I think you got to learn what you like, what you don't like. How can you delegate? I think delegation is very important in this process, unless you like doing those things, right? You have to make that decision, but you have to have enough information. People who don't have enough information, change is hard because barriers come up that you had no clue were going to be there, and it makes it very hard to get through them. Having said that, there are a lot of instances that will come up that you had no clue. We were talking before we even got started amongst ourselves about, technology is wonderful when it works. So you have to have plan B, C, and D, right? I've been on a call and said, why do I have this silly echo? And, I've got a CEO on the other end, and he doesn't want to wait for me for 20 minutes to figure it out. I've got to know what that plan B and C is right then. So within a few minutes, we can get going on our interview.
Just to say, there are companies who are out there, you could do a quick Google and they will provide pretty much end-to-end service so that you don't have to learn all these skills, but there will be a cost to that. But that might be a cost that you're willing to pay because it saves you on stress and time. Now, as far as best practice goes, let's go back to Rob from LibSyn, who can outline a few of the things that we should be doing in our podcasting lives.
Thanks again. First off, on best practices, I think the biggest mistake I've seen businesses make is in hiring a third party to be the voice of their show. This is something you really want to have someone inside your company be, not some third party you hired from a local radio station or TV station. It is far easier to teach someone in your company how to speak clearly and with good mic technique than it is to teach a third party about the nuances and intricacies of your company and industry. This is really true if you plan on doing any interviews. Someone outside your industry will not know the proper follow-up questions to ask. The difference between a good and a great interview is the follow-up questions asked. The difference between a good and a bad interview is the follow-up questions that were not asked, that should have been. One thing that businesses do worry about that they should not is time, as in how long your episode should be. We've looked at the most popular podcasts and found that of those shows getting over 100,000 downloads per episode, 84% were 51 minutes or longer. There is no such thing as too long in podcasting, just too boring. The short answer to the question of how long should an episode be is as long as a specific episode needs to be. Not shorter, not longer. Here are two clear examples of what not to do. Star Wars, Episode 1. It was 15 minutes of content spread out over 2 hours. Lucas missed the mark. Game of Thrones, Season 8. It was 15 episodes of content crammed into 6 episodes. Also missing the mark. If you have 1 week, 45 minutes of content, you do a 45-minute episode. In another week, if you have 90 minutes of content, you do a 90-minute episode. Podcast listeners will be okay with this. Just don't try to cram too much in a short period of time, and don't try to take too little content and spread it out over a longer period of time. And one last bit of advice, and this comes from Apple. In your artwork, make sure any text you have in your artwork for your show is above the bottom 15%. So if you have a 3000 by 3000 pixel image, the bottom 450 pixels do not have any text in those pixels. If you do, they'll be covered over in the new Mac Apple Podcast app. So just make sure any text in your artwork is above the bottom 15% of pixels, and you'll be good. Make your artwork look clean. Apple will never feature you unless you have good, clean-looking artwork, and the artwork is the first thing people see about your podcast. So take some time, design clean, clear artwork, not too much text, and any text you have above the bottom 15%. And if you have more questions about podcasting, you can always email me, Rob, as in R-O-B, at LibSyn.com. LIBSYN stands for Liberated Syndication. Thanks, everyone, for having me on.
Sonia, I just want to thank Rob from LibSyn very much for that, because it was really good getting those good practices from their perspective, because if anyone knows about good practices in the podcast space, it is LibSyn, which is where we host this podcast.
Okay, very quickly, what would your one piece of advice be to new podcasters? Let's go to Blake first.
That's a really good question. It depends. Think a lot about what you want to achieve with the podcast. And I think in a lot of cases, it won't, like what I've said won't apply to a lot of people. Because I think most people who start a podcast, the purpose of it is business development, especially if you're an accountant or a bookkeeper, you're looking to get clients. And so I see for that purpose, podcasting being a way to create content in a less difficult way. So instead of sitting down and trying to write a 1,000 word blog post for your blog, record it and record yourself talking with somebody about that topic. And that becomes a podcast episode. And then you can turn that in, you transcribe that using a service like rev.com. For $1 a minute, you can get a full transcript. And then you can take that and turn that into a blog post. And I see that as a way to get over the writer's block issue, because I think a lot of business owners, a lot of accountants, bookkeepers are very comfortable talking about a particular issue, especially if it's more of a dialogue, than writing about it. And so it's a way to overcome that barrier.
So you'd advise people trying to try this instead of other types of content. That's the thing that you've learned.
Yeah, like instead of most people are not going to build up a huge base of listeners. So the purpose of the podcast is to demonstrate your expertise, and you need to repurpose that content everywhere, as many places as you can. So it means taking that episode you recorded and transcribing it and using it as a basis for a blog post, and using it as the basis for social media posts about that topic for that particular a client or prospect you're targeting, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. So if I ask you the same question, Julianne, what do you wish you'd known? What are the things that you would pass on to people who are just starting out?
Well, I'm going to look at it from the internal podcast. Blake was talking about, creating a podcast for business development. I'm going to talk about it if you're developing a podcast for your workforce, so you get the other side of it. And my bit of advice there was to engage as many people in your workforce as possible, because then you will have buy-in before you ever put your podcast out there. I think many companies forget to do internal marketing as if they were doing marketing for their outside customers, current customers and future customers. So I would advise thinking about a marketing plan to engage your workforce so that when you put your podcast out there, they listen, they wait for it, and they're excited about it.
So context for it. Create the context for it so that people are going to be more welcoming and it's not just coming out of nothing.
Right. And like I said, it's a marketing plan. When I work with companies, we spend a day, and a big portion of that day is what's the marketing plan? How are we going to get people to go, I want to listen to our company's podcast?
What would you add to that, Georgette? Is that a good piece of all-round advice?
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I ironically, I use podcasts and video when I deal with clients. I create them for their internal purposes, obviously for other reasons. And so it is such a useful medium in terms of getting people to engage with something that is, as Blake was saying, you can do it while you're doing other things. The big thing with it I found was that people are not concentrating on what Julian is saying, is what is it for, how are you using it, whether as a marketing or an operations tool. And we're getting so hung up on the technicalities of how you just need to get it done. And sometimes good enough is good enough if what the people, the listeners are getting is what you want them to get from it. And you start there.
Yes. So don't worry too much about how it sounds, as long as it's of a decent quality. Because I think that given how the major broadcasters have now muscled into the more indie podcasting space, the quality has changed, I've noticed. Mm-hmm. So people might be worried that they're not going to be able to compete with NPR or the BBC. Does it matter?
A little bit, yes. I mean, it has changed the landscape. We're no longer. It's no longer our little secret baby world that like, oh, we've got this to ourselves, and guess what we can do? Yes, now you've got the minute I saw me BBC and the Money Programme all entering, I went, oh, here we go, But not everybody listens to the same thing. People are still going to podcasts to just listen to someone who makes them laugh, or they like the sound of that person's voice, or there's a nuance or a slant in that show that just hits them. That's what I'm looking for. The bigger broadcasters are not as nimble as we are. They have an agenda. They have deadlines to meet, and the thing that they have that we don't have is they're answerable to quite a number of people often. We can pivot and do what we know our listeners want to do. So, and it's the same with other platforms where we are able to put our stuff out into the world. So there's no reason for it to change. Yes, it is more crowded, maybe not as easy to go into new and noteworthy, but none of that matters. I never got into new and noteworthy, but I'm always in what's hot. I have no clue how that got there. I have no idea how. And that's just the beauty of it. I really don't know how. But nevertheless, if I hadn't put it out there, it would never have happened.
And you've created something. You've given the world some value that wasn't there before.
A quick story. My son said he went to a friend's house, and I don't know why they were looking me up or whatever, and he said, have you ever looked up your mum on Google? And he went, yeah, whatever. And he said like, I can't remember the word. It was like, she's fascinating. And he went, oh, for God's sake. And he was telling me, and he was so unimpressed, like, this is really embarrassing, Mum. But you can imagine, these are like young teens, and he's like, your mum's fascinating. Because I did a podcast. I mean, it's mad. Anyway, that was...
So you can get extra added kudos with your kids if you start podcasting.
Not mine.
Well, not my kids, but maybe other people can, yeah.
Now, Kyle, you have been the person that's driven our podcast here, and you know everything there is to know about getting started. I mean, first of all, can you give us a quick bullet point list of what people can do to get started? And also, what's really important in business is having the right metrics to show that you are giving value. How do people go about that too?
Well, as we heard from Rob when he was talking about some good practices, the best thing to do really is to just start from you, because no one knows what you know better than you, and no one can tell that better than you. So start with that, work out what it is that you would say to a friend. If you're going to sit down and talk to someone about your business and what you love about it, you're already enough. That's already enough to start making a podcast. And then getting started, you can do something as simple as recording it on your phone. If you've got an iPhone, use voice memo. You can record it on your Android phone. You can hook your computer up and record it using a very, very cheap mic, which you can get, as Blake said, for less than $100. The thing to do is figure out what your story is, figure out what your perspective is, and who you're talking to. Now, you talk about metrics and data. You can look at downloads, but downloads don't tell you anything about people. You have to get a sense of what your audience is all about. And if you don't know, then the thing to do is figure out, when you go out to a networking event, who do you normally speak to? Who do you normally get on best with? Who are the people that professionally and personally you tend to find that your interactions are the most positive with? Start with those. And then think of your podcast as almost like an audio business card and put it out there. Choose a choose a frequency, not as in radio, but how often you'll be making them. Don't feel you have to do it every day because you heard someone do it every day. They've got a big team and thousands of bucks behind every episode they make, but you haven't. Feel absolutely fine with starting with very little. Have 15, 20 bucks to spend on online hosting. Get a cheap microphone or use your phone. But the most important thing, get your artwork right, make sure it's out there on the necessary directories, and then do it regularly. Once a month, keep it consistent, and start to, as Blake said, and as I'm sure all of us would understand, keep it warm, keep it authentic. And this is something that, from our perspective, we've got 7 different podcast shows that we make at the association. We've got almost 400 different episodes that are out there. One of which, I just have to say, has just been given a Platinum Award by PR News in the States, the Small Biz Brunch podcast. And they saw tremendous increases in hits on their websites, and they had an idea why they were doing it. And this is the other thing. Understand why you are doing it. Do you want people to just discover that you are a real person? Because, and I'm sure all of us understand the touch points. Some people need to be known before they can be liked. And you need to be liked before you can be trusted. And you need to be trusted before someone's going to be willing to take that extra step and consider doing business with you. And you have to think about this podcast as being the way that you connect with people so that they get to know you and hopefully like you. And from that point on, you take it where it can go. So where you get started, focus on what you've already got and putting it in front of people that you're already comfortable speaking to. And that is about as much as you need to get started with.
I would add to that that don't feel that you've got to record an enormous amount because, as we said earlier in the podcast, people are listening on their commute, maybe in the gym, maybe they're doing the housework. And by all means, if you've got a lot to say and it's all interesting, then give it what it's worth. But try and, just to save yourself really thinking too much, doing too much editing, 20 minutes is a good starting point.
Yep, I'd absolutely agree. And I would say it's such a changing world. The industry is changing. We've got all sorts of organizations getting into podcasting. The pressure always seems to be on to go on better, to go bigger, to spend more, to do it more regularly, to make the show longer or shorter.
So a bit of crystal ball gazing.
That's a great question. I think 3 things are coming up next. And the first is tied to what's happening just this week as Apple releases a new operating system, iOS 13, I think it is, for the iPhone. And what that's doing for podcasters is it's putting the Apple Podcast app front and center on the home screen for the first time. So that means that when people look at their screen, they will see podcasts on the iPhone. And because the iPhone or Apple devices is pretty much responsible for about 66% of podcast listening, that's important. But it's also worth bearing in mind that, most of the world listens to Android phones. And this is the other thing that I think is important. It's going to be easier and easier to listen to podcasts, to find them on your Android device. And that's because Google, Apple are doing this now too, are automatically in the background converting all podcast audio into transcriptions. The transcriptions aren't made public, but the fact that they're converting that into searchable text means that those podcasts are now going to be much easier to find online when people are searching for anything about any topic. And it's going to come up and say, hey, there's a podcast about that. So it'll scan the audio automatically. And I think the third thing is that whereas right up to now, Apple's been where most people have tended to go for their podcast discovery. It used to be iTunes, now Apple Podcasts. And most podcast directories tend to get their data from the Apple Podcast directory. What's happening now is you're finding streaming services like Spotify and soon Pandora in the States. You're finding Spotify coming into second place behind the Apple Podcast directory, and that's new too. So there's quite a bit of change going on there. Easy to find podcasts online, easy to spot them on your device, certainly on iPhones when you look at the home screen, and much more visibility in what were just music streaming services now carrying podcasts. So I think it's all good. That's what's on my radar right now.
So, Julianne, what do you think is the future for podcasting?
Oh, I just think more and more people are going to come out and podcasting. I want to tag on to what Georgette said when she was talking about, mainstream people, everybody, all these, what do I want to say, top stars now have podcasts. And I had the same feeling of, oh my goodness, who's going to listen to mine when they can listen to Alec Baldwin or whoever else is out there, Paula Poundstone. Just thinking the ones I was just looking at. But I think the future of podcasting is that there's just going to be more of it. But I also think there's going to be more people listening. Blake mentioned having, not being attached anymore, having earbuds and not being attached or inconvenienced, I think is the word, by a wire anymore. And, when I was first in accounting, nobody listened to headphones while they worked. That was like, oh, you must not be able to do your work if you're listening to something else, right? I mean, that was the lay of the land. And now people who are doing internal podcasts, they want people to listen to podcasts or whatever they want to, the whole idea is with podcasts, especially without video, is that people can multitask. And I think that's just going to grow. And I think what you were saying about, I think in the very beginning, I think it was you, Kyle, who talked about it's on demand. People can listen to it whenever they want. And so I think the future of podcasting is it's just going to get bigger. And I would say the most important piece is that you got to be consistent, whatever that consistent is, whether it's once a month, once a week. You got to be consistent. That's what people are looking for.
Do you have anything to add to that, Georgette? I think that's pretty comprehensive advice, isn't it?
Indeed. And it is exactly the consistency thing that always rang in my ears and said, either you do it and you can do it that way, or you step back from it. But also as well in that piece was, yes, it is getting more crowded and will continue to be more so, because as Carl quite rightly said, these people have a lot more resources to get episodes out. But I've found that a lot of why people listen to the more indie type is because there is a takeaway. It could just be entertainment. True crime is really big at the moment, but it's not just the NPRs that are talking about true crime. There are quite a lot of small 1-person, 2-people podcasters talking about it who are getting as much or plenty of airplay and being listened to by many people with their earbuds in, because they're entertaining, because their personalities are of particular interest, or people like them and so forth. So if you can pick your thing, when we first went in, everybody was doing everything. Every podcast was about interviewing someone about being an entrepreneur or being this or being that. Now you find your thing. Now I can't listen to them anymore because it's the same people, it's the same names, it's the same interview. I've actually found that a lot of in the actual accounting and bookkeeping industry, who would have thought a lot of the innovation is taking place there? I am actually really hooked on quite a few accounting and bookkeeping podcasts, which I never thought I would say, because deep in the back of my mind, well, everybody thinks we're boring, but I really want to help. But we're not at all.
You just preempted my final question, which was to ask you whether, what would you recommend people listen to that are for work podcasts?
Well, I've said the accountant because that was, I needed a lot of the time taking the podcasting out of it and looking at it as a business person. You need that inspiration, and just hearing somebody who is a big platform speaker tell you how they turned over $1 million wasn't doing it for me. But when you listen to an accountant or a bookkeeper or someone who trains accountants or is a franchisor or whatever, tell you about how they got out of that working in your business rather than on it, how they dealt with finding new customers, does networking work, what software and so on. All of a sudden, you're not alone. And I think for most people, if you're listening from a business perspective, obviously if you're consuming for pleasure, it's different. But if you're looking from a business, the podcasts that are finding their niche and speaking with knowledge and empathy from that platform that's who will, because NPR is not going to talk about whether Xero is better than QuickBooks. They're just,
So give us some names. What would you recommend? Name them. Celebrate them.
Celebrate them. Well, I started off with Mike Michalowicz with Profit First, because that's a lot of what I talk about is cash flow and so on. I'm currently listening to an American one called I Love Bookkeeping.
That's brilliant.
I got to listen to that.
No, and what he does is he brings bookkeepers on and he coaches them. He interviews them and then they bring their problems and he coaches them. He's in the US, so that's my current favourite. And there's another one. I lose what it is at the moment, but I think it's build your accounting practice or build your bookkeeping business. And they just interview people in the same way, but they're all people and they tell their journey and how they. And it's not everybody trying to be this big business. Some of them are one person, sole practitioners, explaining how they get through their day and how they get through their week and their month. And it's inspiring and enlightening and such great tips you get. So celebrate your industry and celebrate what interests you. And there are so many more people. If you're into butterflies with yellow spots, you're going to find loads of other people that are too.
So what are you listening to that's giving you good vibes, Julianne?
Well, I started listening to the Disrupt HR after I was on with Kyle, so I started listening to that. And I do quite a bit with the Society for Human Resource Managers. And I have a few friends. Workology is one that I listen to. But honestly, I'm going to be really authentic here. When I listen to a podcast, I really enjoy listening to something that has absolutely nothing to do with business.
I'm with you. Oh, and well, on that note, there's one called What a Creep.
So my favorite show, and a lot of it is because I love his voice, is That's the Thing with Alec Baldwin.
Yes, what a voice.
It's a great show. I don't know if he does his own research or not. I think not, but he asks great questions. He's very knowledgeable when he gets on, and I just really enjoy that show. So I'm like so into business all the time. For me, podcasts, as Georgette said, my thing is pleasure, right? It has nothing to do with work.
Goes to show how spot on you are, Julianne, because when I was training in podcasting, Alec Baldwin was our benchmark for the trainer.
He is great.
Yeah, he was like, they said pick Alec Baldwin or Howard Stern because the styles are very different.
I'm going with Alec Baldwin. We're just saying right now to all the people who are listening, I'm going with Alec Baldwin.
What about you, Kyle? What does it, as the expert in all aspects of podcasting for us, what do you listen to?
Yeah, what do you really listen to, Kyle?
I'm taking my cue from all of you because I think you have to listen to podcasts before you can start making them, because you have to recognize a good one before you can start trying to make one of your own. But one of the things I cannot listen to are these serial killer, real murder, crime. I really do not like those at all. However, I have discovered one that I did like. And there's a podcast which touches on what we do. It's called The Missing Crypto Queen. And it's a kind of a techno mystery thriller podcast, and it tells the story of something that happened about 2 years ago. There's a woman that was going to set up this massive cryptocurrency called OneCoin. Thousands of people bought into it, but it was a total scam. It completely collapsed about 2 years ago. And then this woman, Dr. Ignatova or something, simply vanished. So the podcast retells the story of the missing crypto queen and goes to look for her. So I think that ties a lot of nice things together. Good storytelling. It's true. It's about the world we actually live in, and it's manageable. It's not going to go on for years and years and years because you do get your fill of stuff. That's definitely true. So yeah, The Missing Crypto Queen.
That's excellent. Thank you for all those recommendations. I'm going to download all of them. And I think that's a good place to end our conversation. Thank you to Julianne Sullivan, to Georgette, Rowland, Osborne, Blake Oliver,
thanks everyone,
Kyle Hannon and Rob Walsh. If you're listening to this and keen to learn more about digital mindsets, our show notes have links to all the resources we've mentioned. You can find those by clicking on the episode's info icon in the podcast app or open the episode in your computer's web browser. You'll find everything there. You'll find courses, webinars, and other professional development resources that will help keep you ahead of the curve. Thanks again to our guests and to you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode, we'd love it if you'd share it. You can even tell us using the feedback link in our show notes. We'd like to know what you think and what you'd like to hear more of. And of course, I'd like to wish everybody a happy International Podcast Day for Monday, the 30th of September. Go out, find your voice and make a podcast. From our London office, I'm Sonia Rothwell. We'll be back soon with more conversations that help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Till then, goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.